How's it going, Star Seekers? My name's Luke and welcome back to Star or Shovelware, where today on the channel we're going to be taking a look at an interesting little puzzle platformer called Toodee and Topdee. And this one has some real unique mechanics going on, as you take control of two would-be heroes, each living on a separate plane of existence, who are brought together to save the universe. So let's take a look at this tasty morsel, and make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy my content and want to support both me and the channel. So the story with this one then concerns the creation of multiple worlds by this four-eyed super being, the creation of a mystical semicolon to keep all of the worlds in balance, and the creation of this rather pleasant looking Tashi chap known as Toodee, whose job it is to track and record any glitches in the worlds. After 7 of the 8 worlds are populated, Toodee starts to get a bit of a twitchy bumhole, assuming that once the 8th world is complete he will have served his purpose and thus be erased, and so he hatches a dastardly plan to steal the semicolon and hide it. Unfortunately though, things don't quite go according to plan, as all 8 worlds then become merged, 2 of which contain our protagonists, Toodee and Topdee. Now the story follows their quest to locate the missing semicolon, and it takes them through multiple merged worlds, where they get to meet a variety of colourful characters, including a helpful glitch, several guardians and eventually Toodee himself. And there's plenty of light-hearted humour to be found in this one, as our two would-be heroes bounce off each other, and regardless of the situation they find themselves in, are still able to see the funny side. Despite the game predominantly being focused around the puzzle platforming though, the game's dev actually does a good job of developing the game's characters as well as the relationships between them, and I was pleasantly surprised by how well the story was implemented and how enjoyable it actually turned out to be. So gameplay in Toodee and Topdee is your classic puzzle platformer with a bit of a unique twist, as the game's puzzles require both characters to work together to solve them, with Toodee's perspective playing like a 2D platformer, whilst Topdee's takes place from a top-down perspective like a classic Zelda game. Objects and enemies in the world also adhere to these same perspectives, though unlike our characters, these can exist in both planes, and shifting between characters with the tap of a Y button often changes how they behave. Enemies, for instance, are confined to platforms in 2D's perspective, but in Topdee's they have a lot more freedom, attempting to home in on Topdee, and it's in this manipulation of objects and enemies that the solutions to the game's puzzles lie. Now across the game's world you'll encounter plenty of different mechanics, many of which are unique to one specific world, but one reoccurring mechanic is the movement of boxes and blocks in order to create platforms for 2D to jump on. Now Topdee is able to pick up and carry certain blocks and push others, and the objective in each of the game's levels is to reach the exit portal, which usually requires you to collect a few keys. Things start off relatively simple in the first world, easing you in gently with a spot of platforming, some spiky pits to contend with and a couple of different block types, and it kind of acts as an extended tutorial, giving you a chance to learn some of the important tricks that you'll need to utilise throughout the rest of the game. Upon reaching the end of this first world, you'll also encounter your first guardian and boss fight, which also sees some clever use of the two perspectives, once again requiring both characters to work in tandem in order to defeat the boss. Now again, while the first boss proves to be relatively tame, the game's bosses are no joke and are extremely challenging, with each of them having their own unique attack patterns for you to contend with and solutions to beating them which usually integrate the world's mechanics. Despite the difficulty though, I felt that all of the game's bosses were really well thought out, and though they will no doubt test your patience, they're all pretty fair. Now once you progress into the other worlds, the difficulty and complexity of the puzzles quickly ramps up, and I must admit I really wasn't expecting the level of challenge presented by them. Each new world brings with it new challenges and mechanics to learn and include things like fireballs, enemies which mimic your movements, and portals, and not only do the puzzles themselves really require some brainwork to solve, you also have some tricky platforming to contend with, and the eShop's description isn't lying when it says the game is hard as nails. Thankfully though, the game's developers have been kind enough to provide us players with a whole menu dedicated to difficulty settings, and here you can modify things like how many hits your character can take, as well as turn on things like unlimited air jumping, telekinesis allowing you to grab blocks from a distance, and super strength which enables you to pick up steel blocks, and usually only one of these will be required to assist with getting through a level, but if you're at your wit's end you can always bow out and whack them all on. It's worth noting that the game also contains a 2-player mode with each player controlling a specific character, so if you suck at platforming but have a friend who's decent, you can always get them to help you out. Now I believe it took me just over 5 hours to complete the game, but admittedly I did use the difficulty settings a few times, predominantly on the boss battles, which I have to say I found to be one of the most challenging aspects. After the credits roll though, you'll get to see how few ladybugs you actually collected, which reward the player with something special should you collect enough of them, though how you go about actually obtaining them and what the reward is, I'll leave that for you to discover. All in all though, Toodee and Topdee is one of the most well thought out, challenging and enjoyable puzzle platformers I've ever played, and I'd even go so far as saying that the originality on show here is definitely up there with the likes of Braid and Fez. If you're looking for a challenge though, that is something that the game unquestionably delivers, and for me, this one is undoubtedly a hidden gem of the genre. So like the gameplay, both the visuals and audio in Toodee and Topdee are really well done. While the art direction is relatively simple and the game looks quite similar to other pixel platformers, it's the way in which the perspective shifts affect the visuals which I found particularly impressive, with enemies seamlessly changing from 2D sprites to 8-directional top-down equivalents, and little details like how the background animation stops when the wall becomes the floor just add to the overall quality of the game's presentation. Audio wise, the sound effects are again kept pretty simple, but they all sound good, and I really enjoyed the game's original soundtrack, with it having some nice retro undertones and a kind of repetitive hypnotic quality to it, which made it the ideal kind of music to play along to. So no problems whatsoever with the performance on the Switch with this one. The porting of the game seems to have been well optimised, and I didn't experience any frame rate issues whatsoever. When it comes to issues, I'd say that there were really only a couple that I experienced. The first being that while playing as 2D, jump can be bound to any of the face buttons in the options menu, but it's also bound to up on the D-pad, meaning that occasionally I ended up jumping when I didn't want to, and from what I could see this couldn't be changed. The second issue concerns a few of the game's puzzles, whereby you get around 90% of the way through them, and the final piece relies on a single precise jump or switching of perspectives to do something like stop a box in a certain position, and screwing things up at this point means starting the level all over again, and for me these levels just ended up being overly frustrating. When all's said and done though, Toodee and Topdee is a fantastic puzzle game. There's been a lot of thought put into its mechanics and level designs, and when it comes to my own personal rating of the game, I'm going to be giving Toodee and Topdee 5 out of 5 stars. Toodee and Topdee is a game with some truly unique gameplay mechanics, which like the aforementioned Braid result in a very memorable gameplay experience, but its level of challenge will really test your brain power, precision and patience. And so that about does it for this review of Toodee and Topdee on the Nintendo Switch. As always, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed it and it helped you out. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down below and whether you're going to be taking up the challenge, and if you watch my content regularly but are not yet subscribed, then please consider doing so. For now though, I just want to thank you all once again for watching, and until next time, take care of yourselves and game on.